All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is energy storage and offshore wind, unlocking a critical piece of the clean energy puzzle. Today's webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, and we have a really exciting panel of speakers lined up for you today. Before I pass it to them, I'd like to go over a few very quick webinar logistics. If you'd like to minimize your webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can click on the orange arrow that you see circled here. You can also click on that arrow to expand the webinar console. One thing that you might like to do with your webinar console is to submit your questions and your comments. We will be saving some time following the presentations for a Q&A with the audience. We've got a lot of people registered for today, which I love. That means a lot of good questions. To make sure we get to your question, do you type it in when you think of it? We'll get to as many as we can. Finally, to answer one of our most frequently asked questions, yes, this webinar will be recorded. We will send out slides and a recording today or tomorrow. You'll get that in your email. So that is coming soon. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it now over to Todd Olinsky-Paul. Todd is moderating today's webinar. He is a Senior Project Director at the Clean Energy States Alliance, and he will kick us off today.
Thanks, Samantha. Welcome to the webinar, everybody. I'll do a very quick introduction of Clean Energy States Alliance and the topic, and then we will get into the body of the webinar. If you're not familiar with us, Clean Energy States Alliance, we are celebrating 20 years as a nonprofit working with state energy agencies across the country, helping them to advance their clean energy work of all sorts. Next slide, please. I think we have a slide here that, yes, shows the membership. As you can see, we have lots of members, and we do our best to help them with whatever kind of clean energy policy, program, economics, analysis support they need. Next slide, please. This particular webinar is going to look at two topics that CESA is involved with and has been for a while. One is energy storage and the other is offshore wind. And we're going to particularly be looking at the intersection between energy storage and offshore wind, how they work together. I will just kick it off by saying that on the storage side, where I'm primarily involved, we do a lot of work. We work on large scale projects and equity storage projects with DOE and the national labs. We also work with our members, our state members, in helping them to develop programs and policy around energy storage. We have an energy storage working group that allows state officials to get together and exchange information about what they're working on in their states about energy storage programs and policy. And we also bring in outside experts to speak to that group on whatever topics they find most urgent or interesting. And then on our sister organization, Clean Energy Group, has a lot of work going on in storage as well with their Resilient Power Project, and they provide technical assistance for equity storage projects. Next slide, please. So with that said, I will now hand this off to Sam Schacht, my colleague who works on offshore wind, to tell you about that part of our work.
Thank you very much, Todd. My name is Sam Schacht. As Todd said, I'm a project manager here at CESA, working primarily on offshore wind and helping to manage our offshore wind accelerator. The offshore wind accelerator is a sort of group of several projects that together help our member states and states beyond our members advance offshore wind in the United States. We have a project devoted to helping states incorporate equity into their offshore wind policies. We have a project that brings our member states in contact with experts in Europe to learn from some countries that are further ahead in the offshore wind development timeline and landscape. And lastly, we work with both the state of Maryland and a large group of states interested in offshore wind to promote offshore wind workforce programs. And if we go to the next slide, I can introduce a fourth project that we are working on, and that is the Offshore Wind Power Hub. And while this project is not totally live yet, it will be a website that includes an interactive map to track policies, projects, and lease areas across the United States. Government policymakers and offshore wind advocates will also have access to some additional features in the Offshore Wind Power Hub to help build community among the offshore wind advocate community and help state policymakers and advocates access all of the fantastic offshore wind resources that exist in the world today. Next slide. And so before this, before we hear from our speakers, I just wanted to give a very, very brief overview of sort of where we stand in the US on offshore wind and why this intersection is so important. So in the United States as of May, and so this is a little bit out of date, but the total pipeline for projects in the United States totaled 52,687 megawatts, according to the Department of Energy. And in the Northeast in particular, and I've defined that as Maine, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, those states together have a collective goal of roughly 32,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2040. So offshore wind will be one of the primary drivers of decarbonization in the Northeast, and you can see on this map just how many projects are located in that region of the country. So there's going to be a lot of offshore wind entering the grid in the Northeast, and it has a lot of implications, which we will learn about from our speakers. And I will pass it to Todd to give their introductions.
Thank you very much, Sam. So, I'm not sure why, but it seems as though this is a topic that hasn't gotten a lot of coverage. So I'm very happy to be able to introduce to you some very knowledgeable people who are going to tell us what some of the leading states in the Northeast are doing around offshore wind and energy storage. So we're going to hear from Dr. Tom Ferguson, Energy Storage Programs Manager at the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources, or DOER. Tom is the Clean Peak Energy Standard, and is responsible for developing and implementing new policies and programs to spur the deployment of energy storage throughout the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We're also going to hear from Dr. Elizabeth Mettetal, an economist and director at Energy and Environmental Economics, or E3, as they're known. And E3 recently did a piece of analysis and report for Massachusetts DOER. Looked at energy storage and offshore wind. So Tom and Liz are going to share a deck and explain what the Commonwealth's conclusions are and what they're planning to do going forward. Liz has led projects at E3's Integrated Systems Planning Practice and managed several studies evaluating the cost and feasibility of achieving electric sector decarbonization. She's also managed E3's support for Massachusetts on its long duration storage roadmap, which is the report I just mentioned, for NYSERDA on New York's 2022 storage roadmap, and for Maine on its energy storage market assessment. So lots of state work there, and looking forward to hearing about that Massachusetts report today. And then after Massachusetts, we'll go to New York with Dr. Schuyler Matteson. He's a clean energy planning lead at New York State Department of Public Service, where he leads grid planning efforts under the coordinated grid planning process and electric vehicle proactive planning process. And prior to DPS, he led New York's energy storage program and completed numerous statewide planning studies focusing on long-term decarbonization. So without further ado, and by the way, we have more details in the panelist bios, which are in the handouts section of your webinar sidebar there. So if you're interested in learning more about the speakers, feel free to go there and download that bio document. So without further ado, I will pass it to Schuyler Matteson to talk to us about what's going on with New York.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here. As you mentioned, this is a very important topic. It's very important for decarbonization in New York, especially because of the way our load is broken down. So I'll get to that in a minute. But I wanted to kind of give you an overview of the issues and opportunities we see here in New York State related to offshore wind and storage as they relate to our decarbonization goals. So back in 2019, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act was passed in New York State, and that enshrined a law of zero carbon electricity in New York State by 2040. Not net zero, completely zero. So no amount of generation in New York State having carbon emissions by 2040. As part of that law, we also enshrined a 9 gigawatt offshore wind target by 2035 and 3 gigawatts of offshore energy storage as well. Since that time, we've also advanced that target up to 6 gigawatts of energy storage, and that was part of the 2022 roadmap that Todd mentioned that E3 helped New York State with. So lots happening in New York State, lots of opportunity, and I want to kind of give you a sense of why we're kind of targeting those technologies and what some of the issues are. One of the big drivers of offshore wind need in New York State is our geography. We have roughly 50% of our load packed into a very small geographic area downstate. That makes it very challenging from a transmission and distribution perspective to deliver clean energy into that area. It's not nice and spread out where you can fit a lot of solar panels and windmills everywhere and kind of meet that load where it is. We really need to find other places to put generation resources and have it delivered into New York City and Long Island. That's very difficult to do when we're trying to go from upstate New York to downstate New York. There's a very narrow corridor, which just happens to also have a major river running through it. So transmission development is very difficult and very expensive in that area. So we're actually very fortunate to have offshore wind resources just off the coast of New York City and Long Island. This is excellent from a load perspective. We're having, a lot of ability to manage our congestion on the transmission system by having new interconnections of offshore wind directly into New York City and Long Island. And there's not really many other resources we could even do that with. You can't really put a large-scale solar facility or land-based wind facility anywhere near New York City without having massive costs or just running into bottlenecks. So what we really see there is an opportunity to deliver directly to load, and that's fantastic. But the issue is, as they showed on that slide, all of that offshore wind is in a very small geographic area. That's not great for reliability. We really do not have that type of geographical diversity that we have in the rest of the state. The distance from Buffalo to Albany takes you about 4 or 4.5 hours to drive there, 300 something miles. You can have solar panels spread across the state, and at some point, some of them are going to be producing electricity most of the day, even if you have cloudy conditions in many parts of the state. Same with wind facilities, Plattsburgh, all the way down to Jamestown. Those are 400 or 500 miles apart. You can have a lot of geographic diversity with land-based wind as well. And we just don't see that with our offshore wind. All the offshore wind we're going to be able to interconnect into New York City is in a very small geographic area. If a wind event or a storm event knocks out that power, it's all gone. So that lack of diversity really leads to new issues. So we have some really, really high benefits, but also some really significant issues we have to deal with in terms of maintaining reliability and firming that offshore wind resource. That's exactly where energy storage comes in. There's not many things that can really improve the reliability or firm that offshore wind resource. We have very few opportunities, mainly relying on transmission interconnections to other regions, other zones. But locally, from a local perspective, it's very hard to site new generation resources in and around New York City, as I already mentioned. And if that's the case, it's not going to get any easier when we also rule out the ability to site any fossil fuel resources. Our options are limited, and energy storage is one of the leading candidates to be able to firm those resources. Another thing that storage can do for offshore wind is manage those interconnection costs. If you know anything about offshore wind, it's not cheap. It's very important. It's a great resource, but it is not cheap. Part of that reason is the interconnection costs. There's not exactly a lot of electricity infrastructure in the ocean right now. It just doesn't exist. There's not substations, there's not a transmission system. Every new offshore wind facility that gets interconnected is going to have to be sited somewhere in the ocean and it's going to have to connect to land using long distance, usually high voltage, potentially DC power lines, and come on land at a certain substation. That is not a cheap or easy or quick process. It leads to very high costs for interconnecting that resource. And so energy storage can really help you manage those costs by being a kind of asset at the point of interconnection to manage things like voltage and firming and deliverability and peak impact issues at the landing site. The average interconnection for an offshore wind facility is dramatically larger than the average interconnection of other resources. When you're talking about batteries or solar farms or land-based wind farms, we see in the NISO queue an average interconnection size of around 100, maybe 150 megawatts for those large-scale facilities. The average size of our large-scale offshore wind facilities that are being interconnected is on the order of 1,000 megawatts, so 5 to 10 times larger than the land-based interconnections. And so those landing points where that massive amount of power is being injected have huge impacts on the local electricity infrastructure where it's being developed. That development might have impact on deliverability. You know, those individual substations might be able to handle 1,000 megawatts, but does the local system have the ability to distribute that 1,000 megawatts into the local area? Those deliverability upgrades are not cheap either. You have to potentially make downstream upgrades to make sure that your power is deliverable in all hours, especially in those low load hours, where when we hit our offshore wind target of say 9 gigawatts by 2035 off the coast of Long Island, New York City, there's a chance that in certain areas at maximum capability, we could be injecting more offshore wind than the local grid has load on it. We could actually be making more offshore wind than we need in all of New York City and Long Island. And that creates a new issue of transmission flows. Power flows have never been changed in New York City. It's always been a one-way street, upstate to downstate. If we start reversing that course, the operation becomes difficult. There might be added costs there, and energy storage can really step in to make sure in those hours where we get close to those power flow dynamics, we can manage the injection from offshore wind and shift those to other hours when that load is actually needed more locally. It also saves money on the interconnection, so we don't have to proactively solve those challenges before they happen. As I mentioned, those interconnection points are very, very large. Those injections might have difficulty of delivering their power. And we've kind of gotten ahead of that in New York State. We've done some studies on our own and with the New York ISO to determine, when and where those injection issues might occur. And that has led us to create 2 different processes that we've launched, one for Long Island and one in New York City, to develop public policy transmission projects that will help unmodel that offshore wind to make sure it's maximally delivered, maximally used, so we get our full money's worth for each of those interconnections. It's a very complex issue. We've had to use a lot of interesting and kind of novel studies to figure that out. And we're advancing those types of projects through different proceedings at the New York ISO. One of the important parts about energy storage pairing with offshore wind is how you're going to actually locate it. Many of the ISOs say they have a preference for energy storage to be located separately on the network so it can manage other issues in addition to individual resource curtailment issues. But offshore wind is one of those cases where co-locating, quote unquote, electrically, energy storage devices or long duration storage devices or hydrogen generation devices such as electrolyzers, co-locating those resources may be a very important, very strategic outcome to manage those costs and to minimize the losses that happen by having to have offshore wind develop separately, build their entire interconnection, manage their own deliverability, inject power into the grid, have that power go through the system with all its transmission distribution losses, and then charge a battery when the NISO dispatches it, for example. It might be a lot cheaper and more cost effective and reduce curtailment and interconnection costs a lot more if those resources are actually paired. That's kind of an issue in some places. Many places don't have fully baked hybridization market models yet at their system operator level. And so that's going to be an issue we're managing moving forward to make sure that we can take full benefit of the pairing of resources of offshore wind energy storage at points of interconnection and make sure we can dispatch them for maximum ratepayer benefits. We also need some more advancements in transmission. We're actually kicking off a process. We kicked off a process last fall called the Coordinated Grid Planning Process, where we're going to be analyzing from a very granular perspective the entire transmission and distribution system of New York State to figure out what's the best, fastest, cheapest way to get to our 2030 and 24 electricity decarbonization goals, while managing the need for zero carbon electricity and cost-effective interconnections. So that process is underway. We're in the process of doing some capacity expansion modeling. We'll be moving on to power flow and production cost modeling here in the near future to figure out where and when exactly these resources need to be developed and how that informs our procurements and our transmission deployments. One last thing I'll say is that in New York State, we've already taken a lot of steps to actually procure and deploy these technologies. We're not just in the target setting analysis phase, as I've been kind of talking about to this point. We have an entire offshore wind program you've probably heard about. We've run multiple phases of offshore wind, what we call ORECs, offshore wind renewable energy credit procurements over the last few years, and have thousands of megawatts under development. Same goes for energy storage. We've had an energy storage program since 2018, funding a lot of energy storage projects across our state, and we're hoping to take more steps in energy storage sometime this year as we launch our second phase of energy storage projects and programs to get us to the 2030 target of 6 gigawatts. One last piece of integration between offshore wind and energy storage is a piece people don't think about as much, but it's the capability of storage to provide transmission services themselves. We talk about energy storage potentially serving as in a market model perspective, managing energy fluctuations, curtailment issues, all those things that are showing up in the energy and capacity markets that the ISOs might run. But it may be very strategic to have energy storage sited at offshore wind interconnection points or nearby substations and operated either by the utility, a developer, the New York ISO, as a transmission asset to manage other issues with the grid that are not currently monetized. There are many aspects of managing a grid today, like inertia, black start, voltage capability, reactive power, that are not optimized in the real-time energy market or co-dispatch with real-time energy and ancillary services. Those are kind of out-of-market issues that energy storage just happens to be extremely good at providing. And so if we want storage to provide those services, we're going to have the ability to integrate those into ISO tariffs, which it's not currently allowed in New York State, but allowing energy storage to provide those services may be a much cheaper and faster solution than trying to develop, say, another 1,000 megawatts of transmission lines inside of New York City. So we're very, very strongly supportive of things like storage as transmission for these projects as well. So that's kind of the overview of New York State. We're pushing very hard on offshore wind. We think we may even go beyond 9 gigawatts by the time we get to 2040, just because of the location and the value of that resource. We're likely to go far beyond the 6 gigawatt energy storage target by the time we get to 2040. And so hopefully that gives some folks some optimism and some insight as to how New York State is actually thinking about these things and deploying them today. So thanks again for having me. And with that, I think I'll pass it back over to the organizers so they can move us on to the next presentation.
Great, thank you, Schuyler. Before you go, we do have a couple of questions that you might be able to just address quickly that are directed to you. One is, why is the offshore wind area so concentrated if that's an issue as you've described?
There's a couple of things. One is just natural geography, the actual offshore wind interconnections that are available to New York State. When you think about how New York State is laid out, we have this giant, state over here, and then New York City is this tiny little dot with Long Island off of it. Just south of Long Island, that's really the only offshore wind area that is actually touching New York State that we can actually access to develop offshore wind. We're not necessarily limited to that. Theoretically, we could use waters off of, say, Connecticut or Massachusetts or Rhode Island or New Jersey and have lease areas there that interconnect into New York State. But when you start thinking about interconnection costs, we already have to do 5-10 miles of HVDC interconnection, HVDC power lines underwater, under the ocean, into New York City. When you start saying we need to put that interconnection to 50 or 100 miles away from New York City, that becomes basically economically infeasible. And so it's basically two things, the difficulty of interconnecting resources that are dramatically farther away and just the basic geographic layout of New York State.
Thank you. I think that's good for now, and we'll go ahead and we'll get back to you with some more New York related questions after the rest of the presentations. So Tom and Liz, if you want to take over.
Sure, thanks, Todd. I'm just going to kind of introduce the study that we worked on with E3 and basically set it up for Liz to kind of go through the bulk of the analysis of what was found in this new energy storage study. It's called Charging Forward, with a particular emphasis on the offshore wind piece. Next slide. So just quickly about our organization. So E3, highly experienced, good energy consulting firm. They're the ones who did the study with us, the analysis and the modeling. As mentioned, they have worked with a lot of other states on very similar problems. Next slide. And us, so I'm with DOER, the Energy Storage Programs Manager, and our mission is to develop and implement policies and programs that are aimed at ensuring the adequacy, the security, the diversity, cost effectiveness of our energy supply here in the Commonwealth, that it must be clean, affordable, and a resilient future for all of our residents. We're within the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, and I'm within the Renewable and Alternative Energy Division, which owns, our portfolio standards. But we, have got lots of other groups, working on various aspects of energy policy and programs of the Commonwealth. Next slide. So setting up what led to this study and some of the findings, especially around pairing offshore wind with storage. So back in 2022, there was a legislative requirement for us in consultation with Mass CEC, the Mass Clean Energy Center, if you don't know, to conduct a study on the current status of storage. So basically where we've come from since 2016, 2017, when the Commonwealth started to really think about energy storage with the State of Charge report and the Energy Storage Initiative, to what the role of storage could look like looking out to 2050 and meeting our energy and climate goals, and in particularly what role could mid and long duration storage serve to ensure reliability on a decarbonized highly electrified grid. So the Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2050, this was released December 2022. This lays out our plan to achieve net zero in 2050, essentially calling for greenhouse gas emission reductions of about 85% relative to 1990. For the electric sector, this translates to 93% reductions and about a 2.5 times increase in load relative to 2020, and just a ton of deployment of renewables, as you'll see in the next slide. And in particular, there's lots of scenarios that were modeled in this, and the Commonwealth uses the phase scenario, and this is what served as the basis for the reliability modeling that Liz is going to get into. Next slide. So just to kind of lay out what the CECP is calling for and what our plan is, on the right, just kind of want to show the scale of, renewables that this plan is calling for. This is New England wide, by the way. We're part of ISO New England, so these analyses are for the entirety of New England. It's a ton of renewables. If you look at 2050, if you add up the solar and the wind pieces, you're talking over 100 gigawatts of renewable generation on the grid. So we're talking a dramatic change into what generation is going to look like in the next decades. And also looking on the left here, we see like how this, portfolio and plan, will impact our peak. So right now, we're in a summer peaking system. 33 gigawatts is what the projected summer peak is going to be by 2030. But as we, move out to 2040 to 2050, we start to move into a winter peaking system and, a substantially higher, winter peak that has to be met, 55 gigawatts potentially, by 2050. I think that's it for me. Next slide. Yeah, I'll pass it to Liz.
Great, thanks Tom, and thanks everyone for joining today, and CISA for having us. So as Tom said, the evolving New England system that we're looking at is one that is pretty dramatically different from today. And when we think about the role of energy storage and offshore wind in contributing to our region's resource adequacy needs, it's going to be a function of those evolving loads and the penetration of renewable generation, and how that renewable penetration is going to shift the sort of net or remaining load need over the course of the year. So if you look at the heat maps on the right here, for this talk, I just wanted to emphasize that the reliability need, for 2030 on the top is, already a little bit different than today. So it's going to be shifted really to that 5 to 8 p.m. period in the evening. And, what this heat map is showing is kind of the periods of the relative resource insufficiency, or kind of the highest periods of resource need. Or another way to think about it is, loads minus renewable output. And so we know as we, build out some solar generation, that's going to shift the net peak into the evening. And we know that short duration storage resources will be really well equipped to sort of clip that evening peak. But then when we start to move towards 2050, as Tom just showed, both loads and supply are pretty dramatically different from today. The peak in the winter is going to be more pronounced and extend longer over the course of the evening, and that's really driven by electrified heating demands, which we expect to be, particularly high, right, in those coldest winter months in the evening. We still do see some reliability risk in the summer. We're still have high building demands for air conditioning and an evening need, but the greatest resource needs are certainly in the winter. And so this is important when we think about, what is offshore wind and storage going to do for the system. And we have, these offshore wind potential resources with, estimated potential capacity factors of, 50+% output in the winter. And that provides a real value to the system to meet that evening peak. And then, of course, storage of increasingly long durations is going to be able to help meet the sustained need over the course of the night, as we'll show on the coming slides. So you can go to the next slide. So for the work that we did in support of Massachusetts, and for work that we've done, across North America, we rely on what is sort of increasingly the industry standard way of thinking about resource adequacy or capacity contributions to the system, called ELCC. So ELCC is just the quantity of perfect capacity that could be replaced or avoided with renewables or storage while providing equivalent system reliability. So, another way to think about this is a value of 50% means that the addition of 100 megawatt resource could displace about 50 megawatts of quote unquote perfect capacity while maintaining the same level of reliability. And when we think about the ELCC value for storage, what we see across the board really is that there is what we call a saturation effect. So the first tranches of storage that you add to a grid is going to be really effective at clipping those peaks in the evening, or basically if you take that net load shape, it's going to be very effective at meeting those first tranches of resource need. But as you add storage to the system and the remaining need is longer and flatter, then you need storage of longer durations to get the equivalent amount of reliability from that resource. So you essentially see a declining ELCC value, as we show here on the right. You can go to the next slide. So, well, I think that's an important setup to think about the complementary diversity benefits of storage and offshore wind. So, for the New England system, we're really focused on these interactive effects. And this figure on the right is an example of a challenging week where these resources can really work together to provide a huge amount of value to the system. So, storage ELCC is going to be a function. So all ELCCs are going to be a function of the net load shape, right? So the amount of renewables on that system. On the top here, what you can see is that total gross load, where we then layered on tranches of offshore wind And as you increase that wind penetration on the system, so it's meeting some of that gross load need, the remaining net load shape is smaller and peakier. And because this is a challenging week, what we see is that the capacity value in this particular week was only about 4 gigawatts in terms of the amount it could move, the highest peak of net load. And then we took the same week and we dispatched storage. And so here we did 3 tranches of 5, 5, and 10. And storage, again, on its own can clip those peaks and flatten it out, but its ELCC is going to fall, or its ability to reduce the net peak is going to fall pretty quickly after those peaks are filled out. So here it got a capacity value of 15 gigawatts. Now, when you can combine the 2 resources, they have this really kind of remarkable effect on the capacity, reliability contributions to the system, because you first have this offshore wind, which is narrowing the remaining net peaks that need to be filled. And then that that long duration storage can come in and shift down that net peak because it can dispatch over the entire period much lower. So here we see, the combined capacity value when you dispatch the 2 systems together, both from the narrowing peak as well as offshore wind providing a source of energy for long duration storage or storage to charge from in the winter. The diversity benefit of these was 4 gigawatts. So, that's a really powerful impact you can have on overall system reliability. So I'll give you a couple other examples of numbers and of course, refer you to the report to see some of the other kind of analysis we did to sort of estimate this combined value for the New England region. But you can go to the next slide. So the figure here is just reporting those long duration storage ELCCs to give you a sense of the value in the numbers. And we'll actually see, how important it was to have offshore wind on the grid. So what the top line shows is the long duration storage ELCC on top of the state's 2050, what they call the phased portfolio that Tom showed earlier. So this is a portfolio that has, over 100 gigawatts of renewables on it, including around 30 gigawatts of offshore wind across New England as a whole. And if if the region can realize, this vision that is kind of truly transformative, the ELCC of long duration storage, so its ability to provide effective capacity is, more or less perfect through 20 gigawatts of long duration storage penetration on the system before we start to see that decline. Now, if you just limit on land resources, that's the white dotted line, it's still quite persistent. When you lower the amount of offshore wind available, so available for charging as well as shifting around that net peak in the winter, this is when the ELCC of long duration storage starts to fall a bit quicker. So here you can see, after 15 gigawatts of additions, and again, the system still has, 10 plus gigawatts of offshore wind, 10 plus gigawatts of land-based wind, and 20 gigawatts of solar. So there's still a lot of renewables on the system, but you're going to see the ELCC start to decline just because there are less resources for long duration storage to charge from. And, in particular, it doesn't have that offshore wind to sort of work with complementarity and meet that period of relative resource insufficiency in the evenings of those winter months. So you can go to the last slide. So I'm not going to walk through these tables in detail, but I did want to kind of note that we have in the report, which we can send a link to, ELCCs or effective capacity contributions for long duration storage and offshore wind that really illustrate the complementary value of those resources. So, the tables here, basically, the top 2 tables, what they're showing is the ELCC of each resource individually at fixed varying penetrations of the other resource. And so one of the things you'll see is that an ELCC for long duration storage is going to be much higher at high penetrations of offshore wind and vice versa. The third table, what it does is it shows that complementary value by saying, here's what the individual effective capacity is of long duration storage. Here's what the individual effective capacity value is of offshore wind. And when we run the model and estimate the combined capacity factor, here's how much greater that benefit is, and it's going to be higher. So, in 2050, for example, we saw diversity benefits that were, around 15% higher when you had both resources at high penetrations in 2050. So I think, kind of summing that up, what's really exciting about that is, if we can achieve the levels of offshore wind that many of the state and regional plans are calling for, and I think, the region really needs, then it's really a huge reliability asset. And if we can couple it with storage, particularly long duration storage, then it kind of changes that winter reliability challenge in the region, just given such an abundant winter generating asset and the ability for long duration storage to move around that generation to help us meet the challenging winter periods. So great, thanks.
Great, thank you very much. And if we could get all of the speakers back on camera, we've got questions. And we've got about a little over 15 minutes, so we'll do our best to get to as many of these as we can. Thank you all for your presentations. What we talk about energy storage and offshore wind, and in some of these slides, we're talking specifically about long duration energy storage, and in others, it just seems to be storage. Are we really thinking that offshore wind is going to require longer duration storage than we have right now commercialized and available in the form of lithium-ion batteries? And if so, what durations are we really thinking we're going to need? Or is it a blend of short, medium, and long? Or how are you viewing that?
I mean, I can take one stab at that and then, open it up for others, which is to say that, we did some work in Massachusetts thinking about at different levels of renewable generation, how much storage do you need broadly and of what different durations? I think, short duration storage obviously is moving around kind of intraday period needs. And longer durations of storage become more important and valuable as you have less firm capacity on the system and you need to fill these multi-day low renewable output periods. That's when the longer durations of storage become more valuable. I think there's going to be a continuum of storage needs, right? And I think our modeling showed diversity benefits and complementary benefits from short duration storage and offshore wind as well. But as you remove firm capacity from the system, longer durations of storage are just going to be needed to kind of fully meet demands over these longer stretches where you don't have some form of dispatchable firm capacity to generate.
I totally agree with that. I think one of the issues is that it's not necessarily offshore wind that's like begging for long duration storage. It's really the reliability needs that arise in a zero carbon system, like a very low carbon, high renewable system. When we look at our reliability needs in New York State, the vast majority of the quote unquote events that we have to meet to make sure we can still generate enough energy for our supply, the vast majority of the issues that arise happen for a 2 to 4 hour period. There's a bunch more that happen between 6 and 8 hours. And then there's some very rare events that might be 50 to 100 hours every couple of years maybe. And some of those are driven by very, very high load, but some of them are also driven by net load, where the actual generation themselves, maybe the offshore wind, since it's in such a small geographic area, maybe that goes down for a significant period of time, and it results in a significant need for generation. That can be met by any number of things. You could be having a lot of zero carbon firm resources, such as hydrogen fuel cells or any other type of technology that people are developing right now. And that could meet much longer duration. We could also just stack 4 hour or stack 8 hour or try to develop other resources. So it's really about, what's economic to meet all of our reliability challenges in that long-term future. And we've just noticed like a very strategic benefit of locating storage of those short-ish durations, 4 and 8 hours, are very, economic in those long-term scenarios.
Okay, thank you. Somebody is asking about projections of rising sea levels and the impact that that would have on the infrastructure if we're going to offshore wind and obviously going to have to somehow move that power onshore and potentially store it in batteries. Are the projections of sea level rise incorporated into the planning that's going on?
So I can just take a stab since that's kind of my job to lead the planning in New York State. I can say that from our offshore wind the offshore wind development itself is, dozens of feet, above sea level at the moment. They're very, very stable for very, very extended periods. They have to deal with waves and storms already. And so they're fairly resistant to that type of sea level rise. I think the bigger issue, especially in New York State, is the actual issues on demand, the onshore system being able to maintain reliability in those sea level rise scenarios. We have a lot of electricity infrastructure in New York State, especially downstate, that is right down on the East River. It's right down on the Hudson River. It's right down on the coast within like 2 to 5 feet of sea level. We've done some things to help Con Edison harden their system against these flooding issues and sea level rise, but there's a lot more we have to do. But the one thing I would take away from this is that it's not going to be about the new infrastructure we're building, like these offshore wind. Their pylons and everything, they're stable. Most of the electrical infrastructure from them to onshore is already underwater. So more water on top of it's not going to be an issue. The main issue is going to be probably on land in New York City and Long Island.
Okay, so it's not the new stuff we need to worry about. It's the legacy infrastructure that wasn't built with this in mind and is vulnerable, perhaps. Okay, any input from Massachusetts folks on that, or should we move on?
Not something that I personally work on, but I know resiliency is an enormous focus for us. So I'm sure there are others within the Commonwealth that could speak to that issue, and I know we're working on it.
Okay, great. So here's a really interesting question. Somebody is asking, how are you viewing the trade-offs between energy density and round-trip efficiency? As an example, they say hydrogen can provide high density but awful efficiency. A lithium-ion battery system can provide good efficiency but would be enormous at this scale. So the question has to do with energy density and footprint versus efficiency of storing and releasing energy.
Yeah, I know having worked with Liz and E3 in the past, we have looked at these types of trade-offs a lot. It's a very complicated issue because to a certain extent, when you're completely zero carbon, round-trip efficiency means a lot less. It's really about, do you have enough energy to charge that, off peak so you can use it later on peak. The carbon issue that is round-trip efficiency losses in today's system, it doesn't really make as much of an impact. The main impact is on cost. Like, what does it actually cost to build those extra renewables that you need to fill that extra, fill the battery, say, when you need an extra 5 or 10% of energy to charge it because it's lower round trip efficiency? There's a lot of costs that go into that. You have to build the infrastructure, you have to build the solar panels, the windmills to generate all that extra energy to overcome those round trip efficiency losses and then use the power. So it's kind of an economic trade-off. Land use comes into it when you're trying to build that extra infrastructure. But in the long term, I'd say we're a little bit less concerned about round trip efficiency and more concerned about availability and cost and land use.
Yeah, and I would agree with that too. I would be in terms of more concerns about systems needing like larger and larger footprints because we already have enough challenging siting lithium-ion battery storages and just any sort of energy infrastructure in general in the Commonwealth. So, you know, anytime you're asking to cite like a larger and larger footprint system within a, you know, a small state, you know, that's, you know, an even more challenging, you know, proposition. You know, Newark, you know, has more land, so maybe it's a little easier, but I know in New York City from being a developer of energy storage in New York City that it's exceedingly hard to cite projects in New York City.
And I'll just piggyback that from a modeling perspective, you know, increasingly what we find is that longer durations of storage are more frequently valuable as a capacity asset, whereas short duration storage is really more of an energy, you know, basically you need a high round trip efficiency to be competitive in energy markets. And even that, you know, the penetration of storage, and we worked a lot with Tom on this, the amount of storage you need is going to be a function of how much renewable generation and the mix of renewable generation that's on your grid. So, you know, the relative need for short duration storage versus longer durations of storage is going to depend if you're a more solar or wind heavy system, and you know, how much round trip efficiency losses are we talking, right? So, you know, the really long duration assets with really low round trip efficiency are only really gonna kind of pencil economically when you have, you know, near complete decarbonization and you need capacity resources, basically.
Great. Somebody wants to know, looking out to 2050, how do the models of actual offshore wind levels change due to climate change? Are we seeing changes in how much wind there could be?
So is that in terms of the actual wind generation shapes, perhaps, that the climate change might be impacting?
In terms of, as I read the question, it's how does climate change modeling suggest that the windiness of the shoreline where you're looking at putting these things may change? It could get windier or less windy, or the wind could come from different places or different times, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm not sure. We have done some analysis on the long-term impacts to, say, solar installation or wind speeds in New York State. I don't have that offhand. I know just from having reviewed those previously to see what needs to go into modeling, we didn't really have to make any significant changes in New York State. The biggest impacts for us is the potential increase in average temperature, changing our heating and cooling loads. The generation shapes of the individual resources didn't change nearly as much as those.
Yeah, and I'll flag one thing working in the opposite direction is that technologies are getting better, right? Offshore wind technologies are just getting sort of bigger and better at, you know, utilizing wind. And so that's working in the opposite direction. So, but agreed that, you know, NREL and others have done some of this modeling, but, you know, I haven't seen anything that suggests that we sort of lose the high speed offshore wind that's you know, potentially extremely valuable to the region.
Yeah, and
Great.
just on that, I know that also the Department of Energy and NREL and NOAA have just started a project to increase their ability to accurately predict you know, wind speeds, both longer out and in sort of real time. And so I think that is an issue that a lot of people are aware of.
Great. And a related question regarding storms. Somebody wants to know whether the analyses that your states are using take account of the storms that come through every year and will force the turbines to shut down for days at a time. I'm quoting the questioner here. Is that something that seems to be likely or is taken into account?
Very, very possibly. Those things can happen for a couple of reasons. You know, potentially the low wind speed lulls we find are actually more concerning than afternoon or even day or 2-day long storms. Just the general weather patterns of lower wind is actually more concerning for the state. But the load shapes and the generation shapes we use in our modeling do account for those fairly predictable, unpredictable events. We don't know exactly when they're going to happen, but we have a pretty good sense of that they do happen on a regular basis. The NREL generation shapes for offshore wind do account for those potential storm conditions where, for example, wind speeds increase to a point where they actually have to shut down the turbine. So you go from basically max output to zero output very, very rapidly. Those are concerning. Those tend to happen in times of the year when we have other resources on the system generating, but those are still concerning to us. So those are baked into our modeling, but not necessarily to a full extent. And so what we do there is a scenario analysis for, like, bad offshore wind days or maximum outage factors. And the NISO does this also on an annual basis to figure out how, what happens if the system is stressed and what type of reserves do we need to keep online.
Yeah, I echo what Schuyler said, and also, we in the modeling that we shared just use kind of unplanned stochastic forced outages, both for the storage resources and for the offshore wind resources, which is why you wouldn't see a resource that has 100% perfect ELCC.
Great. Somebody is asking about floating offshore wind turbines. I know that's probably something that would be more needed on the other coast, but is that something that you see of use or developing in the market?
On the East Coast, I know maybe Schuyler can speak more to what New York has done, but there are plenty of opportunities to build floating offshore wind farms on the East Coast as well. I think you see a lot of fixed bottom offshore wind because that's a lot easier to build and we already know how to do it. But off the coast of Maine and just farther out off the coast of the Northeast, there's a lot of places where we certainly could build floating offshore wind farms. I don't know if anyone wants to speak to what one state or another in particular, how they're thinking about that.
I can say we've looked into that. We've looked into feasibility, and like you said, we think there's a lot of potential there. Based on our analysis of where the industry is, it doesn't sound like next year we're going to have a floating offshore wind farm built off the coast of New York State. It looks like it's more of a mid to long-term type of deployment. But we are seeing some of those around the world start being actually deployed, either as pilots or as kind of retrofits of existing offshore wind farms. So that's something very, very interesting to us, and we're looking into that more in New York State.
Okay, thank you. So, by the way, for those who are asking about the Massachusetts report, we have put a link into the chat where you can download that report if you're interested in taking a look at it. Presumably all of these state reports and roadmaps are available on the various state agency websites. So you can certainly go and download those. We are pretty much at the end of our time. I want to thank our presenters and ended. I apologize we didn't get to all the questions, but I think we learned a lot and it was great set of presentations. Do we have any upcoming events to announce?
We are working on a bunch. We don't have any currently on the books, but we will send out email announcements when we do have those scheduled.
Great. Well, keep an eye out for email announcements, and thanks so much to everybody who attended, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.